Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor Jonathan Judaken, and we're going to talk about anti-Semitism. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jason. Thanks so much for doing this. It's obviously a big issue at the moment, and I'm glad to be a part of the conversation.
All right, first question. How would you define anti-Semitism?
Okay, so it's a seemingly simple and straightforward question, but I'm going to ask us just to take a bit of a step back. A lot of my work isn't only about the empirical experience of Jews and the history of anti-Semitism per se, but also a lot about the kinds of categories and narratives that we use to even think about this sort of question. So I want to begin talking about definitions of anti-Semitism, which are part of the contested history of anti-Semitism, especially today. And I'll say more about that by starting off by talking to you a little bit about the history of the word anti-Semitism itself. So the term anti-Semitism was first widely popularized by a German political activist and pamphleteer named Wilhelm Marr. And he wrote this pamphlet that was called The Way to Victory of Germanism Over Jewry in 1879. It was wildly popular. It went through many, many different versions. He made a huge amount of money from this pamphlet. And basically what it argued was there was a racial war that had existed between Jews and Germans, between what he called Semites and Aryans, that went back through human history. But that as a result of Jews achieving emancipation, which they got in 1871, when I use that term emancipation, American listeners can think about the Emancipation Proclamation coming out of the Civil War. It meant legal equal equality for Jews as citizens, that they had equal civil rights to other German citizens. And that's what they had achieved when Germany actually became a state for the first time in 1871. And he argued in this pamphlet that as a result of this, Semites, Jews, were manipulating the new rules of this democracy in order to dominate Germans. And they were doing so as a result of the fact that they were able to manipulate both their control over money and the media in order to achieve this domination. He made so much money from this that he was able to create a political party that he called the Anti-Semitenliga, the League of Anti-Semites. And so in this historical moment, we're talking about a context in which you have the rise of nationalism, the rise of masses becoming involved in politics for the first time, and the articulation of a political and racial and programmatic project for dealing with the so-called Jewish question in opposition to Jewish legal equality or Jewish emancipation, okay? And that context is really important because almost immediately after Marr popularizes this new word, it becomes picked up by everyone in Germany and really across Europe as a new way for talking about anti-Jewish contempt or anti-Jewish hatred. And that actually creates a problem in terms of when it comes to definitions. Like for scholars, for example, that historical context is very, very different than the context of the ancient world where you have the origins of what I prefer to call Judeophobia. More on that in a minute, right? Very different context in the pre-Christian world from the world that existed after the rise of Christianity, a very different context after the rise of Islam, a very different context in the Middle Ages from what happens in the modern world. And all of that is very different than what's going on right now in a context in which you have the state of Israel that claims about itself that it is the Jewish state, in which it is a member of the United Nations, an international body that passes international law, that is made up of a whole set of nations, half of which never even existed as nation states before 1945. In a context in which we have globalization and, new forms of social media, right? So a very, very different context. But nonetheless, people use this like one word, anti-Semitism, for talking about all of that history, but also only this one word for naming everything from stereotypes, myths, or images, stories about Jews, tropes, memes about Jews, right? Everything from that to prejudice, the ways in which people might internalize some of these stereotypes and perhaps they become a part of their unconscious bias, right? Prejudice, to discrimination, when these become the basis for legal or social inclusion or exclusion of groups of people. And all of that's different from racism, which has its own history, and different from genocide, right? What the Nazis did to Jews in the killing of, 6 million Jews. So we have this one term, and it's applied to all these different histories and all of this different historical past, but also to all these different modalities. And so definitions are complicated. Now, the most famous definitions circulating today, like the big place in which definitions have come into play a lot today, is really in the politics around Israel-Palestine. And in particular, as a result of something called the IHRA definition, okay, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism. So, for example, in spring, Congress passed something called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. And I want to just sort of very briefly read to you what it says and how definitions become really important with respect to this. This is straight off the Congress's website about the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. And it says, this bill provides statutory authority for the requirement of the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights to take into consideration the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism when reviewing or investigating complaints of discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs or activities that receive financial federal assistance. According to the IHRA's working definition, this is their definition, the one-liner, okay? Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews, all right? It's a weird definition just in terms of the way that it's worded. Like, what does a certain perception of Jews mean? That may be expressed as hatred towards Jews? I mean, isn't it clearly about the misperception of Jews in terms of certain stereotypes and myths about Jews that's important. But then if you go on and look at it, this document articulates 11 examples of the ways in which groups can use that definition to determine whether certain statements about Jews, and importantly about Israel, are anti-Semitic. In fact, 7 out of the 11 statements pertain to Israel. And they include things like, for example, if you characterize Israelis as Nazis, in other words, you draw on that analogy to characterize what's going on, you've slipped into anti-Semitism. If you argue that the Israeli state is racist, anti-Semitic, according to the IHRA's working definition, right? So, and this definition has been adopted by a number of different countries and major international organizations, but it's also been opposed by scholars who have come up with alternative definitions. So I'm a signatory, for example, to something called the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which was drafted by a working group of scholars to come up with a much more coherent definition. But again, that group attempted to sort of sort out the question of when certain discourse around Israel-Palestine became anti-Semitic. These definitions are highly politicized. There's a third definition that's been important, the Nexus document, and in the Biden administration's policy that they've adopted, they've sort of morphed together some of these definitions. So the definitions are contested. Now, all of those definitions are a little bit different than the way that scholars might need to think about the problem of anti-Semitism for their purposes. And so what I've argued in my work, like in my recent book, Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism, where I take up this question of definitions along with a whole nest of other problems within the field, and there are many in the field of anti-Semitism studies. I've argued that really we should jettison the term anti-Semitism as like the major term within the field in favor of a term that I prefer, Judeophobia. And I make that claim for 3 reasons. Like, first of all, as soon as someone calls out something as anti-Semitic, there's immediately a whole series of associations, most of which come from the context of fascism and the Nazis in particular, right? So if someone reiterates a certain myth about Jews, it's almost as if the stormtroopers are coming in, just with articulating a stereotype. And stereotypes aren't quite the same thing, right? So one, Judeophobia defamiliarizes the terrain and forces us to think more carefully about what we're talking about. Number 2, I do think that anti-Semitism makes sense as a term applied to the historical context out of which it emerges. So as an intellectual historian, I think that words are indexes to specific contexts, and it is a useful term for thinking about that period from Wilhelm Marr in 1879 through the Holocaust and the Nazis, in which this programmatic and racialized and politicized form of anti-Semitism was widespread, not only in Germany, but in other places as well, okay? But the term Judeophobia lends itself more easily to periodizing. So we can more easily talk about things like ancient Judeophobia, early Christian Judeophobia, the Middle Ages, the modern period, post-Holocaust Judeophobia today. Okay? And the third reason that I prefer the term Judeophobia is because there are often arguments that are made that anti-Semitism is unique, that it's different from other forms of racism. And part of what I have argued in my work is that while, of course, there are aspects that are distinctive about the history of each kind of racism, in fact, we understand the past only when we understand the history of the ways in which racisms were entangled. And the term Judeophobia links more easily to Islamophobia and to what the anti-colonial writer Frantz Fanon called negrophobia, or anti-Black racism, and xenophobia, and that we actually can't understand accurately the history of Judeophobia unless we understand the ways in which it was entangled very explicitly with things like Islamophobia and negrophobia and xenophobia. But also, it's important to understand this entanglement because of our contemporary politics. That, if people are committed to an anti-racist struggle and to building an anti-racist world, we've got to understand the ways in which all these various forms of racisms are entangled. So here's how I define Judeophobia, okay? Judeophobia is the denigration of Judaism, defamation of the Jewish character, discrimination against Jews, their racialization, and at its extreme, efforts at destruction of the Jewish people. And each of those aspects of the definition correspond to the 5 different modalities: myths, prejudice, discrimination, racism, genocide, but also to the 5 major historical periods that I see as being significant in understanding differences in the history of Judeophobia. That's how I would define Judeophobia and respond to your question about definitions of anti-Semitism.
Thank you for that. So where do you think anti-Semitism, or Judeophobia, as you call it, come from?
So again, a complicated question. The origins of Judeophobia, certainly the origins of stereotypes or myths about Jews, go back to the ancient world, not into the nether reaches of the ancient world, but to the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. The best place to sort of locate the origins is in the ancient city of Alexandria. Alexander the Great created a number of Alexandrias as he conquered the world at that time. But ancient Alexandria in Egypt became this kind of important place in which the origins of a number of myths or stories about Jews began to emerge. And that's because there were a number of Jews living in this city. They had privileges that were granted to them first by the Greek rulers of Alexandria, and then when it was taken over by the Romans, by Roman rulers. They were a significant percentage of the population, but they were competing with Egyptians and with Greeks in that city. And beginning in the 4th and 3rd century BCE, a number of negative Exodus stories begin to emerge about Jews. So Egyptian scholars began to write an alternative history of the origins of Jews from what you find in the Exodus narrative, which is not a narrative that casts a positive light on Egyptians. So you can see the ways in which it might have caused resentment. And the story that they told was that Jews were not redeemed from Egyptian slavery by a god who brought them forth into the land of milk and honey, but rather that Jews were outsiders and foreigners. They were a diseased people, lepers perhaps, who were kicked out of Egypt because of their misanthropy, their hatred of humankind, their zealous adherence to only one God, and so these stories about Jews began to circulate in the ancient world. You also have in the ancient world in 38 CE, also in Alexandria, the first mass violence that is explicitly engendered through the spreading of rumors or lies or myths about Jews in that city, right? So a reservoir of certain stereotypes. Jews as foreigners, Jews as misanthropes, even the notion that Jews would fatten up a child for slaughter as part of their rituals in the temple. So the blood libel story emerges in the ancient world. But more important than that context is really what ends up happening in the context of the development of the rise of Christianity and the separation of Christianity from Judaism in the aftermath of the Jesus movement, right? So the Jesus movement is an apocalyptic movement around the charismatic leader Jesus, and in the aftermath of the death of Christ, a number of texts with stories begin to circulate. The earliest of these are the letters of Paul that end up being collected, and then a number of others, right? And by the 2nd century or so, the Jesus movement was explicitly separating from the Jewish community that it had previously been a part of. Paul was, of course, the apostle to the Gentiles. There had been preaching and teaching about Jesus and this idea of a Messiah and Jesus as the fulfillment of that messianic idea. And by the 4th century, you have the explicit Christianization of the Roman Empire, right? So the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it's around that same time that you also have, for the first time, the canonization of the texts that become the basis of the Christian Bible. And within those texts, you have a series of crucial stories that end up having a very long afterlife, that end up being crucial in the shaping of the history of Judeophobia. Okay? 5 in particular. So, first of all, the narrative has an anti-hero, and that anti-hero is Judas. And there are some scholars, like Chaim Maccabee, for example, who argue this is not incidental, that Judas is named as such because it clearly would have reminded listeners of Judea, which is where the term Jew itself comes from, right? That term. And so one thing is Judas, and the role that he plays in the story is, of course, the traitor who's willing to sell out God for 30 pieces of silver. So you have at once the image of Jews as traitorous and as sort of money hungry. You have the image of Caiaphas and the Pharisees. The term Pharisee still, if you look it up in English dictionary, means hypocrite, right? But these leaders of the Jewish community under Roman occupation within the story are depicted as conspiring together to do anything that they need to in order to maintain their own power. Okay? The third you have within the Christian scriptures is the passion narrative, which normatively in the history of Christianity is the central story of Christ, right? That he comes to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, basically, is what he's doing, right? That's what the Last Supper is. It's a Passover meal. And in the course of this, he's captured by the Romans, and then he is mercilessly he's put on trial, right? And in the course of the trial itself, Pontius Pilate, the representative of the Romans, offers up to this group of Jews gathered around him the possibility of crucifying either Barabbas, who is a murderer, or Jesus. And the crowd chants, "His blood be upon us and on our children." That's Matthew 27:25, sort of the apex of the Passion narrative. And that becomes like the basis of the charge of deicide, that Jews were the ones who killed Jesus, killed God, and they take on the consequences of that. Not only those Jews who were there at that time, occupying, in Roman Judea, but on their children too. They take it on. They are a deicide people. This charge will be developed, right? And then you have things like in John 8:44. John is not like the Synoptic Gospels, but you have in the mouth of Jesus talking to a group of Pharisees, he says, "You are of your father, the devil." So, and the Pharisees become the representatives of, they're the rabbis, right? They're the people who end up shaping normative Judaism in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, okay? Most of these texts, by the way, are written after 70 CE, several generations after the death of Christ, right? And then running throughout the Christian scriptures is a supersessionist narrative. It's a narrative in which there's been an abrogation of Jews and the law, Jewish law, as the means through which to achieve salvation, and a shifting of the gift of chosenness from Jews to Christians, along with all the good stuff that was there in the Hebrew Bible that had been promised to Jews, right? As God's chosen people, has been now shifted to Christians, right? So these five sort of core stories and one-liners and kind of little moments within the Christian scriptures end up being developed in sermons and in Christian teaching and through the course of the development of Christian theology to form the core of what ends up becoming Judeophobia. And it's all a part of defining Christianity in opposition to Jews and Judaism, right? And then in the Middle Ages, you have the development of things like, other stories and myths like blood libel and host desecration and the poisoning of wells. Now we're far away from the origins, which is what you asked me about, right? The other aspect is, of course, that through this process of defining themselves against Jews, and then also with the rise of Islam in the 8th century, right? There's a process as well of the legal subordination of Jews within both Christian and within Islamic culture. And it's through that process that that you have the sort of origins and development of anti-Semitism. So the short answer to your question is its beginnings are in the ancient world. There's a reservoir of stereotypes and myths that begin in the ancient world. But the most important and enduring stereotypes develop with the development of Christianity as it defines itself in opposition to Jews and Judaism.
Okay, thank you for that. So the next question I have is, why does anti-Semitism persist till this day? You know, like the answer that you gave to my previous question is like, it is ancient. Anti-Semitism is ancient and it still exists today. And then I just want to understand why.
So I'll say a couple things. Like, I think that you're locking into one answer to the question, which is it's a deep history. Okay. And I think like the title of a really important book by the scholar David Nierenberg gets at sort of one answer to the question of why it persists. And his book is called, listen to the title, because it's got the whole argument in the title, right? Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. And what Nierenberg shows in chapter after chapter is that threaded through the deep history of the Western tradition, and by that tradition he means Christianity and Islam, is over and over again, Jews are not just treated as people, they become mental props through which a whole series of internal issues are being navigated and thought through and developed over the course of the Western tradition. And in particular, if you're talking about how you define good versus evil, salvation versus damnation, slavery and emancipation, like these really, really core issues, invariably, Jews and Judaism were sort of central to the ways in which these issues ended up being developed. So one part of why it persists is it's a really deep history woven into the very fabric of Western civilization. And then to kind of abet that, I would say I would give you a sort of second version of this that comes from the scholar Leon Poliakov and many others, just in terms of what I've already said, which is that the stories that emerge all developed out of religious conflict. Religious conflict initially between Jews and Christians, and later between Jews and Christians and Muslims. And obviously, within that history of religious conflict, Jews have always been a tiny minority, mostly a diaspora people without a state. And even when they had a state, it was a relatively small one in the larger context, right? Now, to get at why that's important for your persistence, all you've got to do is think about the fact that it is still the case that somewhere around 70% of Americans think of themselves as Christian in one way or another. A really significant percentage. I don't know, I'll throw out a number. It depends on how you define evangelical, but 35 to 40% of Americans think of themselves as evangelical Christians. So for those groups of people, the stories that are in the Hebrew scriptures are absolutely central to their identity. There are, 1.3 billion Muslims in the world? So some of the stories that have emerged out of the context of the development of Islamic discussions about Jews, and that's a different story, by the way, from the Christian story, one that we, could spend some time talking about. But, that's a big number of people who sort of their core identity is also defined around a religious identity. So why it persists, one, because it's a deep history wound into the very traditions of the Western tradition, in particular in the stories that define the religious conflicts that have shaped so much of the Western tradition.
Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit and ask about a more, I guess, a modern issue that I've encountered, which is Charlottesville, right? I saw clips from Charlottesville, and these white nationalists were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And the first time I heard that, I did not understand what they were saying.
So we have to remember, it happens in the context of this Tiki Torch parade in which a group of white supremacists, overtly neo-Nazi and Confederates, are marching around Charlottesville, around a Confederate statue that they are sort of sworn to uphold, and then they begin that chant: "Jews will not replace us." Right? That idea comes from a motif that's become central to white Christian nationalism more generally. It's like resurgence goes back to a French writer in the 1980s, but the ideas behind it have a much longer history in the history of white supremacy over the course of the 20th century. And they're the ideas behind, white replacement theory, or the Great Replacement. And the argument has been for a long time amongst white supremacists that foreigners, outsiders, immigrants are going to end up replacing whites. And the reason that the Jews will not replace us is a little bit mystifying, can easily be decoded if we understand that within white replacement theory, there's this argument that non-white people aren't smart enough or organized enough to be able to do this on their own. And that actually this is a part of an orchestrated cabal of Jewish elites for whom these brown masses are the foot soldiers in their efforts to achieve control and domination, okay? And that part of the ways in which they're going to do it is through the replacement of whites. So it's Jews are the ones orchestrating the Great Replacement theory, but behind the scenes, the ways in which the Great Replacement theory is unfolding is through immigration, through reproduction, through non-whites acceding to political power. That's the basic argument behind it, and it's sort of correlated with the argument that the ultimate what is unfolding is therefore a white genocide, a targeted attack on whites to be replaced by non-whites, orchestrated by the puppeteers who are the Jews. And these basic ideas, we should remember, have become incredibly dangerous. Like, they are the ideas behind the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh, but also behind the mass murder of Mexicans in El Paso, of Blacks in Buffalo, of Muslims in Christchurch in New Zealand. And that geography just gives us a sense that these are global ideas that have been spreading. The latest incarnation actually comes to the U.S. from Europe, as I said, from a French thinker who wrote a book called Le Grand Remplacement, The Great Replacement, who made these arguments. And they are behind not only those 4 mass murders that I talked about, but scores and scores, hundreds of mass murders that have been perpetrated by white Christian nationalists in the name of Great Replacement theory. So it's that moment sort of emblazoned in our cultural memories was a harbinger of some really horrific white supremacist violence that has taken place since then.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. Okay, so I'm just trying to get a better understanding of this. So it's a conspiracy theory, right? There is some global secret Jewish cabal, and they are seeking domination. And the way that they achieve domination is by replacing white people with non-white people. And the reason...
That's part of it, yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. But the reason why that helps them achieve dominance is because the non-white people are less intelligent, and so they're more easily manipulable.
Right, exactly. And they'll end up being ultimately sort of beholden and controlled by the puppeteers, right? So the name that you oftentimes hear in these conspiracy theories is over and over again, including by some of the people who have sort of taken these ideas from the margins to the mainstream, like Tucker Carlson, when he was still on Fox News. It is the Hungarian financier George Soros, who has become kind of the 21st century face of these Jewish conspiracy theories, which go back. So in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the face of that Jewish elite that was behind the manipulation was the Rothschilds, the bankers that had different banking houses across Europe. Today, it's George Soros, this Hungarian financier whose name comes up over and over again in MAGA America's description of a number of conspiracy theories that are all sort of connected in different sorts of ways to this white replacement conspiracy theory. So you're exactly right. That's how this works.
Sometimes when I hear conspiracy theories, I can kind of see maybe how it could be true. And when I hear others, they just sound so implausible to me that it's hard for me to believe that any rational person could believe it. So, for instance, how could there be some international secret Jewish cabal that has all this power? You know what I mean? It's painting with such a broad brush, or perhaps they don't necessarily think that there's some sort of secret committee of super powerful Jewish people, but maybe there's something about Jewish culture that makes them want to seek dominance, or something like that, right? And it's hard for me to make it sound somewhat plausible.
Yeah, because what we're talking about when we talk about conspiracy theories are narratives or myths, right? And myths aren't rational, but they are etiological explanations. And this group that I write about called the Frankfurt School tried to explain why they are powerful and why they take a hold on people. And that's because they personify real social problems that people know they have, but don't necessarily have the language or education to articulate fully. So it is the case that we live in a world in which there are who do control and dominate a lot of the forces that end up shaping people's lives and do, in fact, create the social conditions that cause people to be frustrated and, face all kinds of challenges in their lives, right? The problem is with the conspiracy theory is when you sort of point to the Jews as being the masterminds of this, as opposed to, let's say, understanding something about the nature of globalization and, specific control over corporations and certain aspects of culture that end up shaping people's lives. So instead of like understanding what causes their malaise, they point to who causes their malaise. That is the great trick of the MAGA political project and of all populist authoritarian projects that are like it, right? They misdiagnose the problem by pointing to ostensibly to who is the cause of the problem as opposed to a genuine understanding of what is the cause of the problem. But when you've got a face and you've got a picture, and that face and picture corresponds to some of the deep narratives that are part of the cultural stream out of which you come, because we're talking about narratives that circulate now amongst white Christian nationalists, then you can begin to see how the story could stick, even if for you it's like, seriously, that is so irrational and far-fetched, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've interviewed David Livingston Smith a couple of times, and he's an expert on dehumanization. And he says that it's a tactic that people use to gain power, right? And there's usually a tactic that they use. They'll say, oh yeah, we're suffering right now from all these problems, right? And these other people are to blame.
Exactly.
It's not your fault. It's those people's fault. And then
exactly.
I am the only one who can save you, right?
Exactly.
And so they manipulate the masses by dehumanizing the other. But yeah, so what you said just made me think of that. The other thing that I wanted to get to was the left and anti-Semitism coming from the left, because we've been discussing right-wing anti-Semitism, but I think left-wing anti-Semitism has come to the forefront because of the more recent escalation of violence in the Middle East. At least that's the impression that I get. And I'm wondering if you think it's because the people on the left are conflating the state of Israel with Jewish people.
Right. No, I'm glad that you asked the question, because I have been talking a lot about the right, and make no mistake, there is a tradition of left anti-Semitism and of leftist Judeophobia that goes back to the origins of socialism. A number of utopian socialists, Marx's early writings, right? That's a lot more complicated when it comes to the history of communism. And I'll maybe say a few more things about that if you want, but let's make no mistake about it. It has been the case that, especially post October 7th, there have been cases in which folks on the left who are strongly critical of Israel have clearly crossed the line into anti-Semitism. Let me give you some examples and then back up from there to say some more general things about how to navigate this line between the two. So for me, for example, anyone on the left who's been engaged in a kind of wholehearted embrace of what Hamas did on October 7th, that is anti-Semitic. Hamas is an overtly anti-Semitic organization. It is hardwired into their charter, which has been grafted from the protocols of the elders of Zion, the most important anti-Jewish conspiracy theory. The like directly taken from there in terms of their attitudes about Jews, and that grafted onto an Islamic narrative that has its own history. They are wedded to the elimination of the state of Israel, and they are wedded to the elimination of the Jews who are in the Dar al-Islam, the historical grounds that should have been a part of the Islamic greater community. So if you are an unbridled supporter of what Hamas did on October 7th, it seems to me you are supportive of anti-Semitism and the kinds of horrific acts that they undertook, the systemic raping of women, the capturing of children, beheading, the capturing of people and putting them underground. Like, it was absolutely horrific, and it was built out of particular attitudes about how you wage this war against your Jewish persecutors, right? But also when it comes to things like some of the things that we've seen in the course of the encampments, protesters who have pointed at Jews and said that they should go back to where they came from, that they should go back to Poland, that Jews who are articulating an alternative position to what the pro-Palestinian supporters have doing, being sort of pointed out, like at Columbia University, where they said that you will be Al-Qassam's next targets. In other words, you'll be the next targets of the Hamas brigades, right? So a call for violence. At the same time that I've said all of this, it's really important to be clear that pro-Palestinian activism, that support for Palestinians, that concern about the deep and horrific suffering that Palestinians have undergone since October 8th is not anti-Semitism. And that has to be clear. Like, pro-Palestinian activism has increased on the part of the left in particular since the 1960s, and in particular since the Six-Day War, which resulted in, Israelis occupying a whole number of territories. And that occupation has now gone on for, I forget the exact number of years. It's more than 50 years, 55. I'm terrible at math, right? But 67 to today, okay? So I would say it's important that we not conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Israeli activism with anti-Semitism. So the question then becomes, and that at the same time that we've got to recognize that today it is the case that I think, because your question was, is the anti-Semitism of the left a result of conflating Israel with Jews? So on the one hand, it's really important not to make that conflation. There are non-Zionist Jews, and even anti-Zionist Jews, but they're also a very distinct minority globally amongst Jews. So most Jews do identify with Israel in one way or another, and do identify with Zionism, if what Zionism means. And Zionism really is like one of these terms that we should talk more about, its history, its various permutations. But today it's oftentimes simply used as a way of charging people, like as a negative epithet, right? But if what Zionism means is just that Jews believe that some kind of a refuge is necessary for other Jews, given the history of Jewish persecution and oppression, most Jews sort of identify with that position, right? So when it comes to thinking about leftist anti-Zionism or criticisms of Israel, it really becomes what I would call post-Holocaust Judeophobia, okay? When it is couched in terms of a repetition of older tropes about Jews. So for example, if your criticism ends up sounding like the conspiracy theories that we talked about on the right, that, Israel is the source of all evil, or the source of evil in the Middle East, or the reason that Palestinian suffering is enabled is because of Jewish control over money and the media, what you're doing is articulating your critique in terms of these old tropes or myths that are Judeophobic in their in their origins, right? But at the same time, I guess I want to sort of finish answering your question by pulling apart a little bit the left and the right, because I think that there is some difference. I think that Judeophobia on the left, which is becoming more and more a kind of reflex on the left as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict unfolds and as Israel becomes more and more right-wing, so that there's a form of a kind of Jewish nationalism that looks just like white Christian nationalism, except in the Israeli context, okay? That is exclusionary and racist in the same ways that white Christian nationalism is, right? So I would say that on the left, Judeophobia is primarily ideological, whereas, and that's dangerous, matter, but ideologists on the left tend not to be primed and armed for violence in the same way that ideologists on the right are. And that's, I think, an important difference. And when I say the right, what I mean is, of course, white Christian nationalists, but also jihadis, right-wing. Make no mistake about that. These groups are right-wing. Hamas, Hezbollah, Qaeda, militant jihadi groups animated by a deep strain of post-Holocaust Islamic Judeophobia are right-wing groups as well, right? And they are armed and ready to engage in violence.
Okay, yeah, I think there's a useful distinction to be made there. Your audio cut out for a little bit, so I think you were saying that Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al-Qaeda are all right-wing.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
that's what I would say.
Okay, yeah, I was reading your lips just to to understand what you're saying.
I'm sorry about that glitch.
No.
I don't know what happened.
Yeah, no problem. So a last question that I have is, what do you wish people understood about anti-Semitism or Judeophobia?
Yeah, I would say that the one thing that I wish people would understand is that Judeophobia is the scaffolding upon which all modern racisms developed. And if that is the case, and I'll explain why it is the case, and people should understand that it is the case. If that is the case, then it must also be the case that if you are committed to trying to create an anti-racist world, you're committed to the fight against xenophobia, Islamophobia, negrophobia, and Judeophobia equally, because in fact they're all entangled together. And so let me explain just very briefly, like, why it is the case that you have to understand that Judeophobia is the scaffolding. For all modern racisms, it's because really the context of the national unification in Spain and then its development as a major colonial power in the New World was the crucible through which all modern racisms developed. And if you know a little something about that history, you know that from the period, let's say, first century from 1391 to 1492 or so, in the effort to create a unified Spain under one king with one religion, there was a systemic effort to persecute both Jews and Muslims who had previously lived for hundreds of years in Spain in a form of coexistence. And when Jews were forced at the edge of a sword to choose between either converting to Christianity or dying, and they converted en masse for one of the first times in Christian history, which is interesting, and they therefore became Christian. That led to the passage of limpieza de sangre laws beginning in 1449 in Toledo, blood purity laws that basically said you had to prove that you had no Jewish blood in your family going back 7 generations. Otherwise, you couldn't become a member of the church or of the military or of the other aspects of the social orders of the society, right? All of that happens in the context of the process of the purification of Spain. And then 1492 happens. Columbus sails the ocean blue. You have the colonization of the New World. Shortly thereafter, you have the development of the transatlantic slave system. And you have the development of the very conception of race and racism. Raza is a Spanish word first used in the 16th century. Okay? So what you have in that context, in other words, is a paradigm case of the ways in which Judeophobia served as scaffolding. Wrapped around it, entangled within it, was Islamophobia, because shortly after Jews were forcibly expulsed from Spain in 1492, Columbus's second voyage was actually paid for with some of the gold that was money that was extracted from Jews living in Spain. Moriscos, Muslims, were also forcibly expulsed from Spain, and all of that in the context of the development of the advent of modern European colonization and the development of the transatlantic slave system, which is when the category of race becomes enmeshed with anti-Blackness, right? You can see there that Judeophobia is the scaffolding for all these modern forms of racism. So if you understand that history, then you've got to also understand that if you're committed to the fight against racism, Judeophobia, when it rears its head in its various ways, is something else that you've got to be committed to fighting. That's the sort of main thing that I would want people to take away if I only get one, right? And then the other thing is just learn more history, interrogate these posts in more detail. The history of Judeophobia and the history of racisms more generally is not a simple black and white story. It's a complicated history that actually is a passport into some of the core aspects that define who we are today, how we think about our world, what some of our core values are, and what they ought to be, right? So it's a really interesting past to interrogate.
All right. I think it's a great place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here. I enjoyed this conversation a lot.
Thanks so much for asking me, Jason. I really appreciate it.